first thing I saw when I pulled up to my parents' estate was a valet who blinked at my car like it had rolled out of a scrapyard instead of a 2008 Subaru. He took the keys with the same delicacy someone might reserve for a used tissue. I didn't care. The old girl still ran smooth and smelled like fresh pine wipes and construction dust, my kind of luxury. The house hadn't changed since I'd last been here. Stone facade uplighting too dramatic for a residence and a fountain in the front, shaped like an abstract bird that had never taken flight. It was the kind of place that made people feel small the moment they stepped inside. That was the point. My mother, Margot Marin, had said as much in a magazine profile once. A home should make a statement before anyone speaks. Tonight, the statement was a birthday dinner for me. My 34th. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't expected it. I'd gotten a stiff email from my sister Ivy that read, "Dinner's at 6. Try not to be late. It's a whole thing." So I showed up, because curiosity is a powerful drug, and because part of me wanted to see what kind of thing they'd turned my birthday into. The entry hall was filled with orchids and the smell of lemon polish. A server I didn't recognize took my coat. Ivy appeared in a cloud of perfume and beige cashmere, looking me up and down like I'd shown up wearing crime scene tape. "You didn't dress up." I looked at my ironed button-down and black slacks. "I did," I said. She smiled tight. "Right. Functional. So you." I followed her into the dining room where the long glass table gleamed under a chandelier shaped like antlers dipped in gold. Margot stood at the far end, wrapped in something silky and seasonal with a brooch that looked like it had its own insurance policy. My father, Douglas Marin, was already seated swirling wine in a glass larger than his commitment to active listening. They all looked up when I entered, and for a second I felt like I'd walked into a scene I wasn't meant to interrupt. Then Margot clapped twice. Oh, good, she made it, and just in time for the first course. I took the empty seat they'd saved for me at the end of course away from the power center of the table. Beside me, a cousin I barely knew was talking crypto. Across, Ivy's boyfriend was describing the emotional labor of managing influencers. No one asked me anything. They never did. Margot raised her glass. "Before we dive into the ceviche, let's toast our little Ellis 34 today." A polite smattering of claps followed. I lifted my water. Margot continued, eyes gleaming. She showed up empty-handed as always. "But we're just so glad she's here." Laughter. Real effortless, like someone had dropped the punchline of the night. I smiled, lips closed. Douglas leaned back, eyes scanning me over his wine glass. "To our little Mooch," he said smoothly. "May she one day bring more than her appetite." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was satisfied. It was the sound of people who thought they'd landed something sharp and clever and entirely deserved. I set down my glass, and then I reached into my bag. They didn't notice right away. Margot had already turned toward the server, signaling for the salad course. Ivy was adjusting her phone on a miniature tripod, prepping for some kind of Instagram-worthy shot. Douglas was saying something to the person on his right about lease-to-own strategies. I pulled out a single manila folder. Nothing fancy. No dramatic snap of a briefcase. Just paper. I set it in the center of the table and slid it forward with one finger. "Actually," I said loud enough to cut through the next round of wine pouring I paid for this house. That got their attention. Douglas blinked. Ivy stopped mid-frame. Margot tilted her head like I'd just spoken in binary code. I opened the folder. "This is the deed I said. As of 3 months ago, this property is under my name. Bought it from the bank. Closed clean. Paid the taxes, settled the liens, covered the renovation debt. It's mine." For a moment, no one spoke. Even the staff froze. Douglas leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him. "The house you live in. The one we're sitting in. You refinanced it last spring to cover Ivy's second launch. The terms defaulted. You didn't know that." Margot's smile twitched. "This isn't funny. It's not meant to be." I tapped the edge of the folder. "Everything's in there. Recorded, signed, notarized." Preston, the cousin, made a sound like a deflating balloon. Ivy just stared, and then I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of water, letting the silence bloom. I'd been Ellis Marin, the overlooked child, the mooch, the girl in boots who never brought gifts. I'd been their proof that success was visible, polished, staged, but tonight I handed them a different truth. One they couldn't laugh off, one printed on paper, signed and sealed. And for once, no one had a thing to say. My parents have always said the Marins do things the right way, but that's never meant honest or kind or even fair. It's meant loud, polished, and profitable. In our family, those were the 3 pillars of worth. And when I think back on the house I just claimed with a single folder on a glass table, I realize it wasn't the property that made it valuable, it was the image it protected. That, to them, was everything. Douglas Marin. My father built Marin Residential from the bones of his father's lumber business and the glitter of real estate seminars that sold dreams in leather portfolios. He wore suits that cost more than my first year of college and told reporters he was in the business of elevating communities. What he really meant was flipping neighborhoods into something unrecognizable to the people who once lived there. To him, legacy was about volume, square footage, project, count, press mentions. He made himself a symbol of success in our part of Oregon, shaking hands at ribbon cuttings and giving interviews in front of drone-shot developments with names like Whispering Pines and Summit Ridge. My mother, Margot, played her role just as flawlessly. She ran the philanthropic arm of the company, the Marin Foundation, which specialized in tax write-offs with good lighting. She organized galas and silent auctions posed with oversized checks for causes she barely read the mission statements of and curated our family's narrative like a brand manager on salary. Her smile was permanent and heavily trained, the kind that made you feel you just disappointed her even if you said nothing at all. And her approval was the currency that none of us, especially not me, ever had in abundance. Then there was Graham. Graham, the golden boy, the firstborn. Tall, gregarious, a private school quarterback who now ran a portfolio management firm out of a building my father owned. He spoke in numbers, and charm, knew how to sip bourbon without blinking, and once appeared on the cover of a local business journal under the headline Next Gen Gravitas. He wasn't at the dinner last night. He rarely was. Graham's absence was always excused important client meetings, tight deadlines, international calls. But he never missed a chance to be photographed at fundraisers or to remind us that he was the one carrying the family name into the future. My parents adored him. He looked like success, which to them meant he was success. Ivy, my younger sister by 5 years, came out of the gate swinging and never stopped. She made a name for herself on social media as a lifestyle founder, plant-based candles, sustainable home kits, organic everything. She wore neutral tones and floated through rooms like a rebrand. Her companies changed names and missions every fiscal quarter, but it didn't matter. She was a Marin. She understood that appearance mattered more than substance. Our parents invested in her ventures like clockwork, hosted her launch parties in their backyard, and even flew in her favorite florist from San Diego for her last pivot event. Ivy was trendy, charming, messy in a way that read aspirational. They called her a visionary. She once called me unbrandable. As for me, I was the one who fixed the garbage disposal when it jammed, who could rewire a faulty outlet, who knew how to calculate roof loads and drainage gradients in my head. I was the practical one, the quiet one, the one who didn't get invited to brunch with potential investors or asked to speak at business panels. I picked STEM when they expected business school. I joined the Army Corps of Engineers instead of taking the internship my father arranged at his firm. They saw it as rejection. I saw it as survival. I don't think they ever quite knew what to do with me. I didn't dress the part. I didn't network. I didn't chase the same kind of wins they understood. I liked things that worked. That functioned. They liked things that sparkled. So I became a kind of mascot for the family's humble roots story trotted out at functions to prove we hadn't forgotten our working-class values, then tucked away before the photo ops started. I was tolerated, not celebrated, a Marin in name only. And maybe I let them believe that. Maybe I kept things simple on the surface because it was easier than demanding a seat at a table built on vanity. While Graham played finance prince and Ivy ran candle empires built on borrowed branding, I worked. I built. Quietly. Efficiently. And somewhere along the way, I stopped caring whether they saw it. I just cared that it lasted. Still, I can't lie. It felt good to watch their faces shift when I laid that deed on the table. When the people who had spent years brushing me off finally saw something they couldn't ignore. Not a title, not a brand, just proof. That house wasn't about revenge. It was about making them realize that I'd never been empty-handed. They just never looked past my hands. The first property I ever bought was a 2-story walk-up off Burnside, sagging at the corners and stained with the ghosts of neglect. The mailbox cluster out front leaned like it had given up trying to stay relevant, and the roof had a hole wide enough to see the stars through. But the bones were solid, and for me, that was enough. I found it 6 months after I got out of the service. My right shoulder was still recovering from surgery, the kind of repair that reminds you every time it rains. I had a VA check a laptop and more time than people thought I deserved. No one was hiring a 31-year-old female engineer with a gap on her resume and a military file thicker than a graduate thesis. So I didn't wait for a job. I bought a building. Marin Works Development started the way most things in my life did, quietly. I registered the LLC under a different address, not my apartment, and used a nondescript P.O. box in Springfield. I kept my name off the site registry and opened a separate checking account under the business. Everything clean, everything invisible. What the Army taught me about logistics I now applied to real estate. You move fast, stay under the radar, and never give your opponent a clean shot. The first flip took 8 months. I lived in one of the units while I worked painting at night, laying floors on weekends, learning plumbing from YouTube, and a guy named Curtis who drank too much coffee but never overcharged. Most of the tenants who moved in were veterans, single moms, or retirees with more fixed income than options. I didn't need them to thank me. I just needed them to stay. And they did. By the time I sold that building to a preservation trust, I'd doubled its value and kept the rent under control. Then I bought the next one. And the next. 3 buildings later, I had a crew. Small, reliable, local. I paid them before I paid myself. No one knew who ran Marin Works. That was the point. I didn't want attention. I wanted leverage. And leverage doesn't announce itself. It waits. The house I just revealed at the dinner table, my parents' estate in Ashwood Heights, was my 4th acquisition. It came to me almost by accident. A foreclosure listing buried in a municipal audit report. The house had been refinanced twice in 3 years. The last lien was heavy attached to a line of credit flagged for business use. Ivy's startup was the listed recipient. I remember staring at the screen reading it twice. They had mortgaged the house their house to cover Ivy's luxury e-commerce pivot. A project that last I heard was now a podcast series about sustainable skincare. She called it Skin Deep: The Beauty Beneath. Apparently, the beauty beneath cost $600,000 and a refinance package with a balloon clause. The house hit auction. I moved fast. I used a holding name Ashhaven Properties LLC and closed within the month. No fanfare, no interference. I made sure the tax records stayed generic and let the bank handle the leaseback transition. My parents received the renewal notice from a property management firm I'd worked with before. They signed without blinking. Paid market rate. Slightly above, actually. Margot even complimented the new landscaping in one of her Instagram stories. For 6 months, I let them live there without knowing. Part of me didn't plan to tell them at all. I figured I'd sell it back one day or roll it into a trust after they were gone. But then Ivy made a post mocking trust fund girls who drive old cars like it's a personality. It wasn't about me directly, but it was close enough. Then came the birthday dinner. The jokes, the toast, the word Mooch. And suddenly I realized silence only works when it protects you, not when it protects the people who built their legacy by stepping on your back. So I reached into my bag, and I handed them the truth. It's strange how easy it is to hide in plain sight, to build something real while everyone else is chasing shine. My buildings weren't shiny, but they were sturdy, occupied, legal, profitable, and most importantly, mine. Graham bought watches. Ivy bought attention. I bought buildings. They called it playing small. I called it owning the game. And now they were living in a house I paid for sipping wine beside a deed with my name on it, and they had no idea I was just getting started. I was 21 when they cut me off. It wasn't a fight, not really. No screaming, no ultimatums. Just a quiet meeting at the country club cafe, a line of mint leaves floating in Margot's iced tea like they could distract from what she was saying. "We just think it's time you learn the value of independence," she said, folding her napkin neatly in her lap. My father nodded, barely looking up from his phone. "You chose engineering, sweetheart. That's admirable. But it's not family aligned." Family aligned. That was their code for not what Graham would do. I'd gotten a partial scholarship to Oregon Tech, not Stanford, not Wharton, and I'd refused the unpaid internship at Marin Residential that came with a wink and a business card from one of Dad's friends. Instead, I'd enrolled in mechanical systems design, took a work study in the campus machine shop, and started tutoring calculus to high school seniors on weekends. Apparently that was betrayal enough. They didn't say it like punishment. That was the cruelest part. They said it like they were doing me a favor. Like severing the credit card and the lease and the monthly living stipend was their way of toughening me up. Margot even said, "This will be so good for you, darling. You'll finally learn to stand on your own." As if I hadn't been standing for years. The truth is, I didn't ask for their money. I just didn't think they'd take it away as soon as I stopped performing the version of me they preferred. What made it worse was what happened 6 months later. Graham called one night. I was in my dorm's communal laundry room, folding shirts on top of a dryer that rattled like it was haunted. His voice was smooth, cheerful, too cheerful. "Hey, Els. Quick thing. I need you to sign as a reference on something for me. Just a formality." It wasn't a formality. He'd used my name and my social security number probably lifted from some old FAFSA form stored in Dad's office to apply for a bridge loan to cover a shortfall in one of his investment projects. By the time I realized it, the mail had already come. The delinquency notice was addressed to me. I confronted him. He said, "Relax. I'll pay it off in a month. It's not even that much." Like debt tied to my name was a matter of inconvenience, not identity. I told my parents. Graham spun it. Margot said, "Your brother's just under a lot of pressure." Douglas said, "Don't overreact, Ellis." It was a technical error. They didn't fix it. I did. I spent months chasing paperwork, freezing accounts, filing disputes. That's when I learned how fragile your future feels when someone else gets to write your credit history. I left not long after, not just the house or the school, but the entire world they lived in. I joined the Army Corps of Engineers without telling them. I didn't ask for permission or blessing. I just showed up at the recruiter's office, filled out the forms, and left a voicemail after I'd shipped out. I don't know if they were embarrassed or relieved. The Corps taught me things my family never could. How to build airfields in deserts with nothing but tarps and grit. How to draft a load-bearing structure with a busted pencil in the back of a Jeep. How to survive weeks without mirrors' applause or anyone pretending your last name meant something. I learned how to make things last. Not pretty things, real things. I learned to move unseen, to plan 3 steps ahead, to observe before speaking. Stealth logistics infrastructure. That became my language. My strategy. And the more I learned, the more I realized my silence had never been weakness. It had been protection. A shield they couldn't recognize because they only understood loud power. Flashy wins, public proof. I never gave them that because I didn't need them to clap. I needed them to underestimate me. Every time they called me aimless, frugal, disconnected, it gave me room to move. Every eye roll about my car, every joke about still doing that army stuff, every side comment about how I never leaned into the family name, it gave me cover. They never saw the LLCs, the building permits, the deals made in my name, not theirs. I stayed quiet because silence made space, and in that space I built everything they thought I'd never have. Not in spite of them, but because of how easily they erased me. Now they sit in the house they mortgaged for Ivy, sipping from glasses I bought beneath a roof I repaired on a foundation I own, and they're just beginning to understand I was never empty-handed. They just never looked hard enough to see what I was carrying. Silence stretched across the dinner table like a spill, slow spreading, impossible to ignore. No one moved. My mother's fork hovered mid-air, her perfectly painted lips parted in a frozen half-smile. Dad blinked at the deed like it was a foreign language. Ivy stared jaw slack, her champagne flute trembling just enough to make the glass ring. Then, like she always did when things cracked beneath the surface, Margot laughed. Not a full laugh, just a clipped, practiced trill, the kind she used at galas when someone told an off-color joke. "Oh, Ellis," she said, reaching for her water with fingers just a bit too stiff. "You always had a flair for drama, really handing us a deed. At your own birthday dinner." She turned to the others, smiling as if trying to rescue the mood. She's always had a sense of humor. Douglas cleared his throat. Twice. His politician reflexes were kicking in, smoothing over panic with that practiced calm. "Let's not turn this into something bigger than it is," he said, voice tight but steady. "Ellis, thank you, of course. If this was your way of contributing, it's generous." His hand moved instinctively to his wine glass, then paused, likely realizing drinking would only make him look less in control. Ivy stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the marble floor. "This is a joke, right?" She snapped, eyes darting between our parents and me. "You didn't actually buy the house?" I met her stare. "I did. But how you don't even—" She stopped, shaking her head like the math didn't compute. "You can't afford this. I did the math," I said evenly. "And the down payment. And the renovations. And the taxes. I've been paying them for 6 months. Your podcast startup helped cover the rest." That hit. Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned toward our parents. "You told me the house was tied up, that the refi was temporary." Douglas tried to rise, but Ivy was already storming off, heels pounding against stone, clutching her designer clutch like it might anchor her to some version of reality that still made sense. Margot reached for her wine. "Well," she said too brightly this certainly turned festive. "I didn't stay long after that. I let dessert pass without touching it, thanked the caterer on my way out, and drove home in silence. No radio, no calls. Just the steady hum of tires and the faint ache in my shoulder from tension I hadn't noticed until now. The night had gone exactly as I planned, and still it left a dull weight in my chest. Vindication, it turns out, isn't always sweet. Sometimes it just confirms how far gone things really are. The next morning my phone rang at 7:04 a.m. Douglas. The time was intentional, early enough to avoid Margot's interference, but late enough not to be alarming. I let it go to voicemail. Then again, when he called at 7:16. The third time I picked up. "Ellis," he said, voice low and deliberate. "We need to talk. I figured this was coming. You could have warned us." I let that hang for a second. "You could have asked." There was a pause on his end, a rustle like he'd stepped onto the back patio or into his study to lower his voice. "You embarrassed your mother? You blindsided your sister?" "No," I said. "I revealed something you didn't think I was capable of." "There's a difference." He sighed, the kind that signaled exasperation more than regret. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder, Ellis, and you've always assumed that was my problem. Ivy is emotional. Margot is trying to protect the family image, and I'm the scapegoat who's supposed to stay silent so no one has to feel uncomfortable." I cut in. "Not anymore." Another long pause. "What do you want from us?" I leaned back against the kitchen counter, the morning light just starting to creep in through the blinds. "Nothing. I bought that house to protect it. I gave you space to live without knowing because I still respected the history. But if you're going to keep pretending I'm a mooch or an afterthought, then maybe it's time you start paying attention to whose name is on what." He didn't speak for a moment. "Then, are you threatening us?" "No," I said. "I'm telling you the truth. For once." I hung up before he could respond. It wasn't satisfying. Not exactly. But it was something I hadn't felt in years real. And that more than anything was why I stayed quiet for so long. Because in this family, truth wasn't welcome unless it was dressed in politeness or profit. But now, the truth had a title deed, and they had to live in it. The file folders were still warm from the copier when I spread them across my kitchen table. I'd picked them up from my attorney's office that morning, printed copies of every deed transfer, refinance agreement, and corporate filing connected to the Marin estate and its affiliated properties. Most people don't realize how easy it is to find the truth when no one thinks you're looking, especially when they've trained you to stay out of business conversations. I used to think I didn't belong in their world of trusts and equity and private meetings at the club. But now, flipping through pages marked with signatures I recognized too well, Douglas's looping initials, Margot's crisp script, I realized I'd been excluded on purpose. Because silence makes the perfect cover. The first surprise came fast. The house, the one I now legally owned, had been refinanced not once, not twice, but 3 times in the past 5 years. The latest agreement, dated just 14 months ago, had pulled out nearly $600,000 in equity. I scanned the loan terms, my eyes catching on the clause that used the property as collateral not just for home improvements, but for business cash infusion. There was a line item marked simply Asset Reallocation to Ivy L Ventures, LLC. Ivy's boutique consultancy, if you could call it that, had a website filled with buzzwords like intentional brand synergy and luxury alignment, but no products, no clients listed, no tangible portfolio, just curated Instagram stories and her face in perfect lighting. I'd assumed it was a vanity project. Now I saw it for what it was: a funnel, a vehicle, one that had quietly siphoned over $850,000 from family property under the guise of next-gen entrepreneurship. Further down, I found another familiar address, our old lake cabin. It had been used as collateral, too. Sold off in a strategic exchange to an entity listed as Ashgrove Advisory Ltd. A few clicks on my laptop and I traced it back to a shell corporation with a registered agent in the British Virgin Islands. I didn't need a forensic accountant to tell me who set that up. Graham. I hadn't heard from my brother in months. He hadn't been at the birthday dinner, not that I expected him to show. He lived in Miami now, or maybe Zurich, depending on who you asked. He was the family's crown jewel, once early IPOs, tech conferences, interviews on local news stations about being the face of next-gen Marin leadership. But every time he burned through a deal or disappeared from a board seat, Douglas smoothed it over. Graham is exploring bold opportunities, he'd say, like failure was just a prelude to reinvention. Now here it was, in black and white, an offshore fund operating under the name Marin Global Bridge, a direct lift from Dad's old company tagline. It didn't list Graham as the manager, of course, but it used his former addresses, his business partner's signature, and our family name. They were all hiding behind it, our name, and I was the only one who'd ever been told to stand on my own. The irony made my chest go tight. They'd called me a mooch, a burden, the one who never fully launched. But the truth was, I'd been the only one playing without a safety net. No refinance bailouts, no legacy loan forgiveness, no offshore buffer or quiet equity transfer. I'd built every inch of my life from scratch. And now I could see how much they'd taken for granted and how much they'd gambled away behind closed doors. I sat back in my chair and stared at the stack of papers, the edges still sharp, like they hadn't yet absorbed the weight of what they held. This wasn't just about a house. It never had been. It was about pattern, power, the belief that perception could overwrite fact if you just threw enough charm or shame on top. Margot had once told me at a holiday party right after I got back from deployment that the family had optics to maintain. I'd laughed it off, thinking it was about table settings or her charity foundation. But now I understood. Optics was the whole game, and I'd rewritten the rules the moment I handed over that deed. I wasn't supposed to be looking at balance sheets or deed histories. I was supposed to be grateful, quiet, a supporting character in their curated legacy. Instead, I was standing in the middle of the story with receipts, and they had no idea how many more I was ready to pull. The first time I held a deed with my name on it, I was wearing second-hand boots and a flannel shirt I'd stolen from the Army donation bin. The paper trembled in my hands, not from nerves, but from disbelief. I hadn't even told anyone I'd made an offer, not my parents, not Ivy, not even the guy I was half dating from my welding cert class. No one knew, because no one would have understood. It was a 6-unit building off 14th in Hayward, a block from the VA hospital in Springfield. Half the windows were boarded up, the paint peeled in long gray sheets. The back stairs looked like they'd collapse if you sneezed near them. But I saw potential. The listing agent called it a tear down. I called it an opening. I'd spent 3 weeks walking past that building before I finally went inside. Just watching, tracking who came and went. One guy in a power chair navigating the cracked sidewalk like he'd memorized every tilt. A woman who wore the same army sweatshirt 3 days in a row. I recognized their gait, their pace, that guarded look that told you exactly how many times life had disappointed them. They were vets, like me. After I left the Army Corps of Engineers, I thought I'd have options. I had skills surveying logistics project planning, but the corporate interviews were jokes. They wanted flashy resumes and Ivy League names, not someone who could build a drainage system blindfolded but had no LinkedIn connections. So I took my VA loan, my meager savings, and the approval letter I'd triple-checked for typos, and I bought the building. Every dollar went into it. I didn't just hire contractors, I hired other vets. I found Aaron, who had done HVAC work in Afghanistan and now lived in his truck. I met Ramona at the Home Depot tool rental. She patched drywall like she was sculpting. I gave everyone a shot, even if they hadn't worked in years or had spotty records, because I knew what it was like to be capable and underestimated, especially when your name wasn't on anything. I designed the blueprints myself, drafted them at my kitchen table with a borrowed laptop and a ruler I'd had since high school. I measured every room, twice fought the city for rezoning permits, and nearly cried when I passed the fire inspection on the third try. I lived in Unit 3B during construction, no AC1 working outlet, and a leaky faucet I couldn't afford to fix yet. But it was mine. That leaky faucet. It felt more like home than the marble countertop kitchen I grew up in. It took 14 months to finish the renovations, and when the first tenant moved in, a Navy vet named Leo with a limp and a camera hobby, I left a note on his counter with a welcome basket. "You've got a safe place now. No questions asked. Pay what you can the first month." He paid double. That sixplex became more than a building. It was the first time I saw what I was capable of without anyone handing me the plans. No family name, no borrowed reputation, just me, a blueprint, and a belief that something broken could still stand. Every building I've developed since then traces back to that one. Marin Works development wasn't born out of revenge. It was born out of that peeling sixplex, out of the realization that legacy could be built from repair, not just inheritance. That safety could be designed intentionally with the right hands. Sometimes I go back and just stand across the street from it. It's got fresh siding now, window boxes. The lights stay on late, which means people feel safe staying up. There's a flag hanging from the second-floor railing, faded but still proud. No one there knows the owner lives 3 hours away, or that she used to sleep on a rollout mat in Unit 3B. They don't know about the burn marks on the kitchen tile I covered with vinyl, or how I cried the night I finally got the heat working on all 6 units. But I know. That building gave me my first real identity. Not just as a veteran, not just as a builder, but as someone who could create safety because she never had it guaranteed. That's why I stayed quiet when my parents called me a mooch. Why I didn't fire back when Ivy made passive-aggressive jokes about my handyman hobbies. Because deep down, I knew they didn't have what I had. They had stage lights and applause. I had foundations and keys. And I never forgot the sound of that first lock clicking open. The email came in just before noon. Simple subject line: transfer confirmed. I clicked it open from my phone while standing in line at Jitter's Coffee, barely glancing at the menu board. I didn't need caffeine, I needed clarity. And that subject line delivered it. The deal had closed. The land on Alder and 32nd Prime Corner real estate in East Portland was officially under the control of Marin Works Development. My name wouldn't be on anything public, of course. Just the LLC. Just the blueprints. Just the plan to turn it into something real, housing, not gloss. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and ordered chamomile tea. I wanted something still, something quiet to mark what felt like the loudest win of my life. For 6 months, I'd watched the public meetings, read the city filings tract, who was talking to whom. Douglas Marin had a proposal on the table for that exact lot. A luxury condo build, 43 units, valet parking, rooftop, plunge pools, wine lockers designed not for Portlanders, but for people fleeing California with stock options. The city had hesitated not because they didn't want the money, but because of the protests. The site sat next to a food pantry and a transitional clinic for displaced veterans. A teardown like that would displace over 100 people within 6 blocks. But the real surprise was the seller, a third-generation landowner named Mr. Mendoza, soft-spoken and sharp-eyed, who'd inherited the plot from his grandfather. I met him through a community zoning panel. I listened more than I talked. I asked questions the others didn't. "What do you want to see happen here?" I remember asking him, notebook in hand. He didn't say profit. He said dignity. The deal with Douglas had been nearly inked. Press announcements were drafted. Ivy had even posted a cryptic champagne story with the caption, "Next Big Launch." They thought it was a done deal. And then Mr. Mendoza backed out. He never explained why publicly. He didn't owe them that. But privately, after a few months of meetings and coffee and site walks with me, he'd said something that stuck. "Your plan keeps people here. His plan replaces them, so I offered fair market price. No games." And with the help of a green infrastructure grant and a veterans housing incentive, I mapped out a 10-year redevelopment vision, 60 units, 80% low-income accessible, every tenant with a garden plot and access to on-site mental health care. My architect, a disabled vet from Eugene, called it dignified density. It was the kind of project that didn't make magazine covers, but it made homes, and now it was mine. What Douglas didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the missing puzzle piece in their deal had been quietly secured by the person they'd dismissed for years. The Mooch. The quiet one. The girl who built from the basement up. Part of me wanted to tell them right away, to let the victory burn fast and bright. But another part, older, steadier, knew better. I didn't need to swing the wrecking ball. I could let gravity do it. Let the press release go out. Let the Marin PR machine spin. And then let it all collapse when the public record updated and the truth hit the papers. The landowner was me. And their luxury dream gone. I walked back to my truck T, warming one hand, the weight of the moment settling into my shoulders like armor. The project would take years, and I wasn't naive about the battles ahead, funding gaps, inspections, backlash from the developer's circle. But I'd built tougher things on less stable ground. That night, my phone buzzed, just as I was prepping dinner, couscous and baked cod, quiet comfort. The screen lit up with Mom, mobile. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, a text from Ivy. Just one word, WTF. I smiled. Maybe they'd found out early. Maybe the whispers had started. Or maybe it was just the aftershock of my birthday dinner still echoing through the family group chat. I hadn't checked it in weeks. I slid the phone away and poured olive oil over the couscous. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Because when the press release dropped on Monday, when the city named Marin Works as the developer of the East Alder Housing Initiative, there'd be no going back. They wouldn't just see me as someone who embarrassed them at dinner. They'd see me as someone who could stop their next deal cold, someone who could build without them. And this time, I wouldn't have to say a word. The blueprints would speak for themselves. The first time Keiko helped me with numbers, we were both in uniform, crouched under a flickering fluorescent light in a forward ops tent, trying to reconcile a busted generator's repair costs. She could read numbers like most people read faces, spotting deception in decimals. After deployment, she went civilian and forensic. Now she consults for federal audits, corporate fraud investigations, and when I call family cleanups. I figured it wasn't just about a house, she said as she slipped her laptop onto my kitchen counter. No one drops a deed like that unless they've got more than property to reclaim. I handed her the files. She didn't flinch at the stack. We started with the Marin Foundation, the one Margot had been parading through gala circuits for over a decade. Its mission statement read, "Empowering women through transitional housing and leadership retreats." But Keiko's brow arched before she even reached page 3. "Ellis, this Empower Her Leadership Weekend in Sedona," she said, tapping the PDF. "These aren't leadership retreats. They're spa packages." I leaned closer. There it was, 3 nights private chef massage add-ons and wine pairings, all listed as board enrichment. And the attendees, all friends of Margot's from her book club and Pilates class, none of whom sat on any legitimate board. Over the next few hours, Keiko traced thousands in foundation money rerouted through vendor names that didn't exist. Cascade Leadership Coaching, Oregon Vision Builders shell companies filed to P.O. boxes tied to old Marin residential properties. It was money laundering disguised as tax-deductible philanthropy. And then we hit Graham's trail. I was wondering when this name would show up, Keiko muttered, scrolling through payroll disbursements from a dissolved Marin affiliate. He's paying 6 employees? At an address in the Bahamas. I blinked. Employees? He doesn't have an office. He doesn't have employees either, she said, spinning the laptop toward me. But he's been claiming their salaries, quarterly, for years. I stared at the figures. Each employee earned just enough to stay below certain reporting thresholds. Each one listed to a corporate services firm offshore, likely automated. It was classic smoke and mirrors payroll fraud. And it was funded in part through the residual cash flow of properties still legally tied to Douglas. They weren't just skating the ethical line, they were neck-deep in federal exposure. Keiko leaned back and sipped the tea I'd forgotten to touch. You've got enough here to raise serious questions. You don't need to burn them. Just light a match and leave it near the gas. I opened a new file on my laptop, titled it Audit Draft, a non-submission. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth, accountability. If I'd done any of what they had, I'd have lost my clearance, my credentials, maybe even my freedom. I started compiling. The spa invoices disguised as programming, the board expenses linked to personal travel, the ghost employees, the foundation's annual reports filed with smiley photos and no financial transparency, the luxury builds listed as community redevelopment to secure special zoning. The land grab in South Portland that never broke ground but mysteriously drained the development fund. Every detail cross-referenced, every number traceable. What'll you do with it? Keiko asked as I added the final source link. I'll wait, I said. Let them keep spinning the PR. Let them push the East Alder backlash on anti-development activists. Let them send out another holiday newsletter thanking the foundation's generous board. She smiled. You going to submit it yourself? No, I said. Not yet. Because sometimes the most effective strike wasn't the loudest. It was the one made on paper, signed in silence, and slid under the right door. And when that moment came, I'd be ready with proof. The email came in just after 7 a.m., time-stamped and polite. Subject line: Preservation Projects. Oregon Monthly Inquiry. I almost deleted it out of habit, like I did the dozens of press blasts and real estate spam that landed in the Marin Works inbox. But this one had a name I recognized: Talia Sandberg, a seasoned local journalist known for her deep dives into civic development and who owned what reporting that occasionally rattled small-town governments. She wasn't the kind of writer who chased gossip. If she was reaching out, it meant someone had fed her a breadcrumb. The message was crisp and professional. Hi, Ms. Marin. I'm working on a piece about emerging preservation efforts in Portland's East Side neighborhoods. Your name recently surfaced in relation to 3 redevelopment sites formerly slated for demolition. I'd love to speak briefly about your vision for these properties and your work through Marin Works development. Completely on the record unless you prefer otherwise. Let me know. Warmly, Talia. I stared at the email for a full minute before exhaling. Someone had leaked me, not the company. Me. Full name, full link. Marin Works had always been a deliberately quiet entity, registered through a holding address. Communications routed through a neutral consulting firm. No family ties, no brand overlap. I built it that way deliberately so I could build without the shadow of Douglas's empire or Margot's curated spotlight. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I pulled out my notebook and started writing down the names of everyone who might have known. Keiko. No, she knew better. Jill, my tenant from the first property. Unlikely. She didn't even know I had a business. The only possible explanation was the deal in East Alder, the one that blocked my parents' luxury complex. Someone on that zoning board must have traced it back. And now the Graveleys were about to realize that I'd been building under their noses and with more integrity than they ever allowed themselves to show. By noon, the ripple had hit. Douglas called first. Is this you? He asked, his voice clipped already mid-accusation. I didn't pretend. Is what me Oregon Monthly? He snapped. They're sniffing around the Alder property. asking questions about funding permits, about why the Marins lost their bid. And now your name's coming up like you're some stealth mogul. I waited a beat. And what would be inaccurate about that? You deliberately undercut your own family's project. I bought a lot your firm lowballed and tried to rezone through a back door. He exhaled sharply. You knew we were finalizing that deal. I knew you were promising a vibrant community space and planning a private golf simulator and rooftop bar. I also knew it sat on what used to be a homeless outreach campus. I let the silence hang. What I did was preservation. What you were doing was PR. Ellis, do you have any idea what this makes us look like? Transparent? Like we're fractured? Like you're trying to sabotage your own bloodline? There it was, the branding logic, the belief that anything not coordinated through the Marin filter was rebellion. That exposure wasn't about truth, it was treason. I heard him pacing, probably on the terrace cell in one hand, espresso in the other, trying to figure out if there was a press release that could smother this before it spread. You could have told us, he said finally, voice low. You could have asked, I answered. A pause. Then, you've always had this need to prove something. I thought after the army, after the surgeries, you'd come back different. Ready to be part of something. I am part of something, I said. It just doesn't wear your logo. He hung up without a goodbye. That afternoon, Margot called too. No greeting, just breathy panic. I just heard. From Becca of all people. Her son interns at Oregon Monthly. Are you really giving an interview? No, I said simply. Then why would they name you? I imagine someone followed the paper trail. That's what real journalists do. You need to shut this down. Call them. Say it's a misunderstanding. I haven't said a word, I replied, but I do read everything. And I'll know if what they print is inaccurate. Ellis, I'm not your liability, Mom. I'm just visible now. She went quiet. And for the first time, it didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like fear. Not fear of me, but of the story they couldn't shape. By evening, I sent a single line to Talia. Thank you for your interest. I'm not ready to speak publicly yet, but I appreciate your work. She replied a few minutes later. Understood. I'll be in touch if anything changes. It had begun. Not the scandal, not the fallout, the shift. They weren't angry because I was threatening their name. They were terrified because I didn't need it. By the time the leaves began to rust along the edge of September, I had stopped thinking of it as revenge. It wasn't even about the deed anymore, or the headlines, or the names they'd called me across polished dinner tables behind crystal glasses filled with Oregon Pinot. It was about structure, function, integrity. Like steel beams hidden behind drywall, most people don't see the rot until something collapses. I had seen it, and I wasn't going to let it fall on anyone else. The first silent partner was Keiko's cousin, a commercial property investor with a zero publicity rule. The second was a retired logistics officer I'd once served with who now ran a construction firm in Spokane. The third was a widow who'd put her entire pension into one of Ivy's failed artisan escape cabins and got nothing back but a glossy brochure and a shut-down website. Quietly, patiently, I had helped each of them recover something. Now in return, they held a combined 31% of the Class B shares in Marin Holdings shares that had been steadily devalued over the past 2 years, while Douglas scrambled to refinance deals and Margot poured foundation funds into gala dinners. The rest I acquired slowly through shell acquisitions, brokered negotiations, and one particularly ironic auction of assets Douglas had offloaded to a management firm. I didn't need a majority. I just needed a seat at the table, and documents no one could ignore. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Not in the conference room downtown with the glass walls and espresso machine, but in a nondescript boardroom I booked under a preservation consulting name. The board members showed up out of confusion mostly. 2 thought it was a Marin community planning session. 1 brought a golf hat. None of them expected me to walk in with a slim folder, a black pen, and an unshakable tone. I stood. Thank you for coming. You're here today not as donors or advisors, but as shareholders. That caught their attention. I'm Ellis Marin. You know the name. But what you may not know is that over the past 9 months, I've acquired or consolidated over 44% of the voting interest in Marin Holdings. Someone coughed. Another shifted in their chair. I'm not here to dissolve the company. I'm not here to humiliate my family. But I am here to stop the hemorrhaging. The company has lost over $3.4 million in the last fiscal cycle alone. And that's not just market fluctuation. That's mismanagement. I handed out the summaries. I didn't lead with the most explosive stuff. Those were for leverage, not presentation. I focused on numbers: inflated vendor invoices, passive rental losses, duplicated charitable disbursements, Ivy's consulting fees, Graham's non-existent international partnerships. I've built things. You can drive by them. You can walk through them. I've paid veterans, hired mothers, restored blighted lots without naming a single one after myself. I paused. What I want is simple. I want oversight. I want the operating agreement amended to require board-level sign-off for any project above $1 million. I want full transparency on foundation fund allocations, and I want independent audits every quarter for the next 3 years. And if we decline, asked one older man, glasses perched low on his nose. I released the audit to the IRS and the Oregon Department of Justice. I didn't blink, and the press gets a summary with names. He leaned back, silent. I don't need to be CEO, I said, voice quieter now. I don't want to sit in some marble office and pretend that legacy means leadership. I just need the bleeding to stop. There was a beat of silence. Then the woman beside him, a former mayor, now a community grant advisor, folded her hands and said, "You've earned your seat." And just like that, the ground shifted. By Friday, I had formal documentation, legal oversight, and the one thing I never thought I'd get from this family leverage. That night, I sat on the roof of the sixplex, the first building I ever saved. My boots rested on the weathered tile, a mug of black tea cooling beside me. Below, porch lights flickered on one by one. A kid somewhere slammed a screen door. A vet 2 floors down tuned his radio to baseball. I didn't need champagne. I didn't need a headline. I had something better: alignment. They'd called me the Mooch, the burden, the quiet one with nothing to her name. But now, with every signature, I had redefined what the Marin name could mean, if only to myself. Tomorrow they'd call. Maybe to threaten. Maybe to negotiate. But tonight, I had the blueprints. And I knew exactly what to build next. The invitation arrived on thick cardstock, as if the weight of the paper could lend sincerity to its message. Family dinner, it read in Margot's impeccable cursive. Saturday at 7. Ashwood Heights. Just us. No RSVP. No emotion. Just the expectation that I would show up as I had so many times before, playing the role of polite afterthought. But this time, I didn't arrive in a rusted sedan. I came in a quiet leased hybrid with tinted windows and legal folders buckled into the passenger seat. No one met me at the door. No one needed to. I let myself in. My name was still on the ownership documents after all, and followed the soft murmurs of candlelight and clinking glass to the dining room. Margot was arranging the dessert forks like she always did, as if the symmetry could hold everything together. Douglas stood by the fireplace, his expression rehearsed into something that suggested remorse, but landed closer to politics. Ivy wasn't there, and I didn't ask why. Ellis, Margot said with a smile she probably practiced in the mirror. "You look refreshed." I gave a small nod and set the slim black folder on the table beside the wine glasses. Not loud, not dramatic, just intentional. We sat. The table was set almost identically to my birthday dinner weeks ago. Same crystal, same floral runner, even the same red blend chilling in the decanter. But this time, no one toasted. No one dared. Douglas cleared his throat after the main course had been picked at more than eaten. We've had time to reflect. And clearly there were some misunderstandings. Misunderstanding, I echoed, my voice soft but sharp. You stood at this table and called me a mooch. He had the grace to glance down. Margot, as usual, powered forward. That was unfortunate. We were caught off guard. You ambushed us with paperwork. I lifted my glass but didn't drink. You mean the legal deed to a house you mortgaged 3 times without knowing I bought it back? That paperwork, Margot's smile strained. You've made your point. No, I said. I haven't. But I will now. I opened the folder, slowly sliding out several notarized documents. A summarized audit. Proposed amendments to the holding company's operating agreement. A letter of acknowledgement confirming the oversight board and the newly mandated financial transparency measures. I laid them beside the dessert spoons. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said, but I am done pretending that silence equals peace. Douglas reached for the audit summary, his mouth tightening as he scanned the top page. Margot didn't touch a thing, just stared at me like she was finally seeing a blueprint she couldn't revise. I'm giving you this house back, I continued, eyes steady. But not as a gift, as a reminder. It's under a land use restriction now. Historical preservation. Can't be torn down, flipped, or used for business retreats. Douglas's face reddened. You're boxing us in. No, I said. I'm protecting the legacy you forgot to guard. I pushed back my chair. I've made my moves. You can keep telling your country club friends whatever story you want. But from this point forward, the rules have changed. Margot's voice was barely a whisper. So you're cutting us off? I turned to her. No, I'm cutting myself out of your narrative. There's a difference. She looked away. I'll be submitting the amended articles next week. I've arranged for a transition coordinator. You'll still be part of the board, but decisions over a certain threshold go through oversight. And the foundation is being reviewed for 501c3 compliance. Douglas stood slowly. So you really want control? I met his gaze. No, I want accountability. And the people who trusted you with their homes, their funds, their faith, they deserve that. I didn't wait for dessert. I didn't need applause or apology. As I walked out, I paused by the foyer where the family portrait still hung painted just after Graham's first promotion and Ivy's startup launch. I was there too awkward in a stiff dress standing slightly off-center. The afterthought. I looked at it, then turned and said quietly, You built the image. I just built the foundation underneath it. Then I left. No door slammed. No final speech. Just the sound of old floors creaking beneath new terms. The courtyard was buzzing again. It always came alive in the late afternoon when the sun dipped low enough to cast long golden streaks over the chipped concrete, and the laughter of kids bounced between walls like wind chimes. Ellis leaned against the stair rail, coffee mug in hand, watching a toddler weave through the planter boxes with sticky hands and superhero socks. The sixplex wasn't perfect. Half the bricks were patched and the railing still creaked, but it was hers. Not just legally, emotionally. On the far wall, 2 teenagers stood on scaffolding painting a mural halfway done, vibrant and surreal. A swirling mix of vines, bricks, and stars. One of the girls had sketched the outline last week, inspired by a conversation about roots and rebuilding. Ellis hadn't told them what to paint. She just gave them permission. And paint. Behind her, the community room door opened with a squeak. Jose from Unit 2B waved a folder. You got a minute? She nodded and followed him inside, where folding chairs were arranged around the long donated table. The tenant board had grown. Tenants now formed a rotating council that oversaw day-to-day maintenance choices, garden plans, and even budget priorities. It had taken months to build trust, but now they didn't wait for her approval. They just included her like any neighbor. We ran the numbers on the solar retrofit, Jose said, flipping to a spreadsheet. With the grant match, we're only short about $6,000. Ellis scanned the sheet, did a few mental calculations, and nodded. We'll bridge it. I'll match half. Let's make the jump. There was a murmur of agreement, not gratitude, collaboration. After the meeting, she lingered in the courtyard as dusk softened the edges of the building. Her phone buzzed an email from a deputy director at the city's Housing Innovation Office. They were launching a pilot program for veteran-focused infill units and had heard about her work from a councilwoman who toured the sixplex last month. They wanted her input, design, zoning hacks, community integration. She smiled at the screen, then pocketed the phone. She wasn't going to answer tonight. Instead, she sat on the front steps, her favorite spot where the cement had cracked just enough to collect water in the spring and echo kids' footsteps in the summer. She watched the lights flick on one by one in each unit, a grandma cooking soup in 1A, The twins in 3C setting up a movie projector on the laundry wall, and in that quiet, Ellis finally exhaled. She thought of the Marin estate, its polished surface, its hollow rooms, and of how many nights she used to dream of finally being seen there, of being invited, not just tolerated. But now, watching the mural take shape, she knew she hadn't needed their table. She'd built her own, one that fed people, lit homes, gave shelter and second chances, one without toasts or titles, just foundations that didn't crack. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own story. She felt real, solid, home. The subject line read simply, "Curious." Ellis stared at it on her phone as she stood in the lobby of a gutted brownstone on Hawthorne Avenue. Her boots crunched drywall dust as she walked the edge of what would soon be the new foundation slab. The windows had been pulled, the wiring stripped, and the walls marked in red spray paint, reminders of everything broken, everything needing replacement. It was perfect. She opened the email. It was from her father. "Ellis, I've been reviewing the preservation filings and the green grant application. Your name's everywhere now, quietly but unmistakably. I have to ask, how did you learn to build like this?" She blinked once, twice, then smiled almost sadly. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't admiration, it was bewilderment, as if construction skills had dropped from the sky, as if her competence were a riddle. But still he was asking. For once. She hit reply. "By listening while you talked." Then she closed the email. She tucked the phone away and kept walking. Up the narrow stairs, past exposed beams and dust-choked sunlight. The top floor had been a boarding unit at one point. She could still see the outlines of twin beds in the worn floor. This building would be different, not just housing, but stability. 3 duplexes for single-parent veterans, with childcare downstairs, a food co-op on the corner. As she traced the hallway, she ran her fingers along the cold metal railing. It reminded her of a day when she was 16, standing in the same kind of hall at the original Marin residential project, an upscale condo her father had designed mostly for golf buddies. He'd walked her through the polished showroom unit with a cigar in hand, saying, "This is what success looks like. Just remember who showed you." Back then, she'd nodded, stayed quiet, tried to memorize the floor plan because that's what he cared about. Not her thoughts, just her silence. Now she walked through beams and rebar, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She thought of the word he'd used, mooch, the way her mother had laughed like it was just family banter, like shame could be dressed up as humor and served with Chardonnay. And the others, Graham Ivy, how they'd either joined in or stayed silent. Because Ellis was never meant to matter, not in that house, not in their story. But what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that Ellis had never been a guest at their table. She'd been building her own. A few days ago, a girl named Bria, 10 years old and already drawing construction plans in a spiral notebook, had stopped her outside the sixplex and said, "My mom says you made this place safe. She said you're like a boss but nice." That Ellis thought that's what success looks like. It didn't come with clinking glasses or press coverage. It came with scaffolding and planning permits. It came from $20 dinners and reused kitchen tiles. It came from quietly choosing not to prove herself, but to build something that didn't need their approval at all. As she reached the rooftop, a breeze hit her full in the face, fresh and sharp with pine and concrete. The city unfurled beneath her in blues and grays and the faint orange pulse of late afternoon. She stood in the middle of it all, her jacket, dusty hair, windswept heart steady. They'd called her a mooch. She let them. Because while they toasted themselves with borrowed champagne and over-leveraged deals, she had been laying brick, folding blueprints, turning insults into mortar. And now, standing above a building they couldn't imagine built from a vision they'd never have carried, Ellis Marin finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd done, not in pride, but in peace. She didn't need to be loud. She just needed to be solid.